Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Yusefian. I'm going to stand up. I feel like I can't see everyone, but I will sit down because it's not all about me. Um, Excited to talk to you today about the important title there, which is the critical link between food security and, let's just be honest, like beyond net zero. You know, we actually have to obviously take food out of the atmosphere, take carbon out of the atmosphere, and food is a solution. My career has basically been coming to all this point where I've seen finance look for this solution. Finance has always looked for the biggest impact, and I've always come back to this area, which is food. Food has the ability not only to solve a climate problem, but it can also solve a social and a healthcare issue as well. So it's absolutely, I believe, hence obviously I'm talking about it, it is the area where it's the best place for climate tech. And this is what we'll get into today. So we've got a great panel. I've tried to represent the supply chain. We've got Alan from AgriCarbon, essentially representing the farm, the soil. We've got Kellyanne from Barry Callebaut, is essentially representing Kellyanne will probably explain to you a bit more about Barry Callebaut, but they are the world leaders in chocolate manufacturing and source from all around the world. So essentially the middle part of the chain. And then we've got Ed from Able and Cole, which some of you probably use, probably in here. Raise of hands, anyone use Able and Cole? There you go, Ed.
Yeah.
Not enough. Sorry to sort that out. And then on the end, we've got Mark Hodgson from Foundation Earth. They are an NGO advocating policy and carbon labeling on LCA. Just before we get started, I'll just quickly tell you about Wiliot. Wiliot is an ambient IoT company. So what they're essentially doing is they have taken the mobile phone. If you think about it, the mobile phone is a device which is connected to the internet, and that's a computer. And now they've condensed it down to this, which looks like a sticker, but this is a computer. And it's batteryless, and it harvests energy from the radio frequency in the air. And this is Internet of Things. And this is before Internet of Things has always been Internet of expensive things. But ambient IoT will essentially be Internet of everything. And this is what we need really to see what's happening in the supply chain, see waste. This could be on products, on packaging. Everything now can be connected to the internet. So Wiliot's very excited to be a technology that can hopefully power and give the data that we need to, let's just say, improve supply chains. So supply chains have the biggest emissions. And this is what we're going to talk about today, is how food can essentially start to remove those emissions. So, right. So to kick off, Ed, we'll start with you. Food is, as we mentioned, some of the biggest emitters on the planet. Let's just say, they say 30% of emissions comes from food. What is Able and Cole doing to, let's just say, hit net zero? What are you doing to kind of achieve those net zero targets at Able and Cole?
Yeah, so it's about getting the word regenerative involved in our supply chains. And in our context, we have always operated on organic sourcing policy. So that means that if there is an organic certified version of something, we will stock it. So the first thing to point out is a bit of a relationship between organic and regenerative. The best organic farmers are regenerative, and the best regenerative farmers are organic, in my opinion. That was plagiarized from Harriet Bell from Riverford, our arch competitor, by the way, so credit where it's due. But if we look right down the supply chain to where it all starts, on the farm, the first thing you noticed about regenerative supply chains, including ours, is just how diverse they are. And that word diversity is absolutely key. There is resilience in diversity. So the D word can never be understated. And when I say diversity, I don't just mean equality, and I don't mean the EDI stuff that a few people kind of get a bit cynical about. I'm talking diversity on all levels. So biodiversity, for example. So on a farm, you would see biodiversity employed and measured. It's a bit of a positive feedback loop. But you would see it in soil health, for example. So really interesting story from our supply chains. A guy called Andy Cato, a few years ago, sold up his production rights to Groove Armada and started farming in the south of France. And he wanted to do away entirely with sides, he called them, pesticides, herbicides, the synthetic fertilizers. And he read an interesting paper by an eminent soil scientist called Christine Jones. And she was researching the power of diversity to replace nitrogen fertilizers. And she found that if you employ diversity in cover crops, so if you reach a certain number of species, they will keep enough soil bacteria alive through their root exudates that they will fix nitrogen for you. So you can do away with fertilizer. Gardeners, you can do away with legumes. The trick is diversity. The number to reach, incidentally, is 8. 8 species of cover crop and higher, and you can do away with fertilizer. So there's a little example of the power of diversity in our supply chains. But in the context of soil health, I don't think diversity can really, like I said, be understated.
So you said, I think the crowd knows about what regenerative agriculture is. If you were to just define how regenerative, very quickly, high level, conventional supply chain today, which creates the emissions, versus yours, you're saying you source regenerative supply chains. It's diverse. What else is it?
So regenerative has no legal protection, by the way. So this is why I use organic in the context of regenerative, because organic is legally protected. It's governed by statutory bodies who have very prescriptive standards. The customer knows exactly what they're buying. And there's a lot of research to show the environmental and social benefits of these practices. But regenerative has no such protection. Anyone can use it. The only threat is the accusation of misleading advertising. For me, obviously it has to cover environmental impact, social impact, but the working definition that I go by is regenerative farming puts back more than it takes on a micro and macro scale over any given length of time. That's my working definition. And I purposefully didn't mention carbon or soil health or anything in particular, because you have to look at a multitude of impacts.
Definitely, I don't disagree. But I'm going to take it to carbon and go to agri-carbon. I hear, I mean, this is what Ed is talking about, like soil tell us about soil. What's its capacity to take carbon out of the atmosphere? Tell us more, obviously, and please tell us about agri-carbon as well.
Well, so soil has a huge capacity to act as a nature-based solution for taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, sequestering it in the form of organic matter in the ground. And unlike tree planting schemes, you can do that without taking the agricultural land out of food production. So from a food security perspective, it's a really valuable nature-based solution that we have in the arsenal. I don't disagree at all with Ed that it's about much more than just carbon, but carbon is a good proxy for a number of those other things. If we are improving the amount of organic matter in the soil, and we can measure the improvement in that change, then the co-benefits that come alongside that of soil health, soil biodiversity, flood and drought mitigation, protection, and so on, they come along with it. The reason that we focus on measuring the carbon side of things is that there is not just it's a good proxy, but there is an active market, and there is a requirement for Scope 3 emissions to be looking at and accurately measuring the amount of carbon. The reason agri-carbon came into being is that we saw that one of the key challenges was accurate measurement of the relatively small changes in carbon stock against quite a big noisy background of carbon in the soil. The traditional techniques were just way too expensive to be able to do that, and we saw that as a blocker for the widespread adoption of regenerative agricultural techniques. There's obviously some great companies, pioneering companies, who are doing it for all the right reasons, but to get that mass scale adoption, having the ability to put a financial value on that carbon, and therefore to reward farmers for taking certain steps down that regenerative path is really important. So our approach is making it affordable so that when you're looking at the carbon value, we're perhaps less than 5% of the overall costs. So that's no longer a barrier to the adoption of those techniques and for people being able to do the carbon accounting within the supply chain.
So carbon has, soil has the ability to, let's just say, pull carbon out of the atmosphere and hold it in there. Can you give us a guidance on like what kind of numbers are we talking about to give some kind of context to the audience of what have you seen as a general average per hectare kind of numbers?
There's a lot of interest in this because it goes to the heart of the business case, and we see a lot of different companies, I think other people on the panel will have views as to where they look at it. We often use as a rule of thumb 1 ton of carbon per hectare per year. Just to be clear, that's tons of carbon. Each ton of carbon is about 3.7 tons of carbon dioxide sequestered from the atmosphere. There's lots of scientific papers out there, some with smaller numbers, some with bigger numbers. We tend to be a little bit skeptical of people coming to us saying we can do 2 or 3 tons per year. Yeah, if you throw the kitchen sink at it, maybe for short periods of time. But 1 ton per hectare per year should be sustainable over a reasonably long period of time, provided you are serious about some of the techniques that you're adopting. So that's cover crops. On other farming types, it might be mob grazing, it's getting your rotations right, it's herbal lays, a lot of different things that fall into it. But I think what's also critical is choosing the right interventions for the kind of farm that you are, for the soil type that you have. That has a huge impact in terms of whether you end up sequestering that 1 ton or whether you end up sequestering half of that or a quarter of it. So a big range.
So it sounds like we're actually completely we're increasing the complexity here, really, on farm for a farmer. For someone like yourself, Kelly, curing from these farmers, how are you dealing with getting hold of this information? Barry Callebaut is a leader on sustainability. It has been on chocolate, for example. How are you dealing, what is your strategy at the moment to deal with this new level of complexity that you now acquired from carbon accounting?
Yeah, so it's a good question. There are standards out there now, or guidelines out there, like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, that tells you what data you need to collect from farms to say whether they are decarbonized or what their carbon footprint is. And we look to work with, startup companies, tech partners in the supply chain to help us capture that data to be able to say what those emissions are from these commodities. Barry Callebaut is a chocolate company. We source all the commodities that go into chocolate. We're business to business. We're selling to the big customers. We source a lot of dairy. We source a lot of cocoa. We source, palm, nuts, etc. And we want to make sure that, where our biggest footprint is, especially in dairy, especially in cocoa, that we are actively fully traceable, fully verifiable, decarbonized commodities are coming through the supply chain into our procurement, and that we can verify this with, digital technologies, remote sensing applications, monitoring, reporting, verification platforms, and we look to partner with tech companies that have those capabilities in the supply chain. Companies like AgriCarbon who are doing that job of making sure the measurements are done in an accurate way, so we can make sure that that emission factor, as we link it to the commodity, has a market value, because again, we're business to business and we want to pass that down the supply chain to our customers.
So has this been a change? Have you seen an acceleration and change in this way of sourcing in the last few years? Or is this, you've been doing it for a while?
There's definitely not enough supply on the market of low carbon commodities.
It's not enough.
There's not enough supply, so it needs to scale. The regenerative practices, they need to scale, at least that's what we see. And of course, we want to unlock the value of where that supply exists, which is also a challenge. And so, we really need to move quickly. Because it will become price competitive quite quickly, as well as other companies look to source their commodities with lower carbon impact.
So I need to get into farming then.
You should. I mean,
recommend it.
You should see those premiums.
Get land, get carbon in the soil, sell it to Kelly. Mark, talk to us about, obviously Mark's a representative, your kind of Foundation Earth is trying to give consumers the understanding, ease. I've talked about there the complexity. Ed said like the supply chain there is getting incredibly complex. Kelly is using digital solutions to essentially, in theory, to sell to Ed. What is Foundation Earth doing on this topic? Like, is it all about carbon? Can you tell us more about what Foundation Earth is doing, and how are consumers going to consume all this information?
Yeah, certainly. So, just fix my mic. Yeah, I mean, it's undisputed. Consumers are adding to their list of things they want to know about their food, alongside calories, alongside cost, of course. More and more information on where it comes from, its provenance, its traceability, its ecological footprint. And these things are becoming increasingly important for consumers. It's not just that consumer pressure, though, it's legislative as well. And so you have to have entities within the food system, and I would count Foundation Earth as being one of those, one of many, in fact, that is basically saying, look, the food system as we know it is highly efficient from a human perspective, but as far as planetary lifespan and its ecology is concerned, it's pretty broken. There's a couple of things you need to do. The first is you've got to measure it. And that's what Foundation Earth is all about. So absolutely right now, because targets have been set and because it is absolutely in the zeitgeist, net zero, full carbon, decarbonisation across the food supply chain is number one. But alongside that, there are a load of other deleterious impacts on the planet that we also need to trace, because some of them might be compounded by and influenced by things that you pick up through carbon measurement, or they may be independent. There may be even trade-offs in that, but for now, let's stick to carbon. We need to basically, I think, have an incredibly transparent and accurate assessment of the ecological footprint, the carbon footprint of every ingredient and every resulting food stuff that starts on the farm and wends its way onto your plate. And if you can do that, you can then start to understand the full ecological footprint across that life cycle. And it's not just consumers that are basically needing this. I think that it's also the suppliers, the retailers, the brands, and also the farmers that need to see it in a sort of more symmetrical manner than ever before, because different legislation is starting to crop up across the planet. We're sitting here in the UK, we're subject to UK regulation on one end, but the food that we're getting has been sourced from many a sovereign state and is therefore culpable to those considerations as well. So what we're trying to do is get our heads around all that complexity, provide a means by which we can gather almost irrefutable assessment and analysis of that product as it moves from food from farm to fork in a way that is entirely measurable, defensible, and you can basically audit that process. If you can do that and you can deliver it to everyone across the supply chain at the same time, and this is why we're a not-for-profit, and this is why we're an independent business, because though we're commercially astute, we know that we cannot show a commercial model that may skew itself in favour of those with larger wallets than not. Give the same democratized data across that piece, and maybe you can start to look at the economic model of the food system and start to work out ways in which the supply chain can cooperate in its data exchange. And that's what we're trying to do with the carbon footprint globally.
And just to give a bit more context, LCA versus carbon, what are you advocating for? Should we just talk about carbon and just the currency of carbon?
Start with carbon. I mean, it depends on the audience in the room, but I'd imagine, given the title, we're talking net zero. So the methodology for collecting a carbon footprint in real time across the supply chain from the moment it's extracted, actually from the years before it's extracted from the ground, because of course there are inputs, right through to the final moment, seating and beyond. There's got to be something we can do. And I think technology companies are starting to see this. I think they're accelerating the process as fast, if not faster, than the food custodians within the food system. Technology companies getting to know the food system before the food system gets to know scalable computing. We've seen that before. So what do we need to do in order to do that? I think it is achievable, and I think there needs to be a standardized methodology, and I know there's some views across the panel on that allows us all to believe in the data before we start making multilateral decisions off it and unilateral ones based on whether we're a farmer, a supplier, or a retailer.
And just while we're on regulation, Ed, what's driving your business regulatory-wise near term? Is anything to... Is it Is it reporting requirements on your business? I mean, I'll go to Kelly in a second, but Kelly's got deforestation as an angle. You're not under that pressure, are you?
At the moment, the biggest pressure, the biggest driver to undertake this activity is advertising.
Advertising.
Being able to say what we do and be heard above the noise. So the Green Claims Code went a long way for a small government. It's quite bold, really, but it's gone a long way in mobilising a legion of armchair activists, of which I proudly count myself as one. That seemed to work for a little while, but now the Advertising Standards Agency, and if the acronym ASA makes anyone in the crowd wince, I feel your pain. They have recently stopped us using the term more sustainable. And I love a regulatory body with teeth. I really do. And they're very open to engagement on the topic, which is great. And the discussions that we've had, they have stipulated that the requirements for us to keep saying more sustainable, and it is a hanging comparison, admittedly, but the requirements are full LCAs, cradle to grave, of all 2,500 products that we sell, with similar comparable data from our competitors.
Sounds like a data nightmare.
Tumbleweed. There you go. Like, exactly. That was our reaction. It was just dumbfoundedness. So at the moment, that's largely. I mean, thankfully we've got a carbon neutral claim to fall back on. Thankfully, we did a second recording. But that, for now, is the biggest pressure that we are facing.
But the technology's there, right? You are using solutions in a business today, software, you're connecting to solutions like, for example, AgriCarbon are powering that information. It's there, it just needs to be glued together, right?
Yeah, it's there, but it's expensive.
Right.
And until things are legislated, how do we know that we're not investing in backing the wrong horse? So far, and I'm not just saying this because I'm sharing the stage with Foundation Earth, but so far, our horses have been winning. So, we're proud of the partnerships that we've established so far and the work that we've done on this. But by and large, the general problem I can see that's stopping people adopting this technology that we need is the investment. They just don't know where to turn. Are they backing the right horse?
Kelly, I mean, do you want to add to that, or do you want to tell us about the pressures you've got, obviously, from you source from around the world? And for example, you've got the EU Deforestation Act to worry about that's coming up in 18 months' time. Do you want to share?
So I'll start by finishing that. So yeah, I mean, investment in the technology is expensive, and we're trying to learn by doing and say, okay, once we put the digital infrastructure in place, how much will it cost, and can we get that cost back as we sell them to our customers? What is the consumer value? Does it have a value downstream in the market? And can we make sure that that cost for the digital infrastructure is paid for downstream? Because that is what ultimately needs to be proven in order to scale these solutions in the supply chain. In terms of regulatory environment, EU no deforestation is a big one for cocoa. We have 60 factories across the globe, so you can imagine we're impacted, and we're sourcing, from 70 different countries, 75 different countries of agricultural commodities. So you can imagine that regulatory environment is quite complex and challenging for us to handle. A big pressure is coming from Europe. A big pressure is, coming from the US as well now, to make sure that we have the full traceability of our supply chain so that we can verify the impact. We have 100% sustainable targets. We need to make them more concrete. We need to make sure that we have the data to verify the carbon emissions of our products that we're sourcing, or that they are no deforestation. And that means that not just having the polygon of the farm, but making sure those practices of the farm flow through the supply chain into our factories, so that we know this lot of product actually has these practices on farms.
Sounds like heaven for an AI company. So, I mean, like, anyone in AI? Anyone in AI? There we go. Good. I mean, the UK government is pushing AI, so again, I encourage you all to get involved in the food system and help solve this problem. So, sorry, Alan.
Can I just add to that the point you mentioned before about the complexity of the supply chain, and as you just articulated it there, when you're buying from multiple different countries and it's flowing through a lot of different partners, you have, if you're, say, a drinks company or a maltster and you're buying your barley, this year you're buying it from these 10 fields on this farm because of rotation. Next year you're buying it off different fields and so on. You've got this huge underlying complexity, and the data needs to be able to flow through that complexity in a way which doesn't require the retailers at the end to need to understand everything that's happened before it. We're talking to a number of companies, major food and beverage companies, which are looking at collaborating in how that information gets mediated, and in particular in making sure that the allocation problem. So there are many farms supplying this customer. This customer is many farms supplying many customers. So you've got a many-to-many problem. What they're trying to do is solve that allocation problem by making sure they're getting really high-quality data in. They're looking after the traceability side of things, so they can then parcel it up and give people the appropriate credentials as it comes to them further downstream. So clearly a big role for the data and AI side of things in there. But I think it's really interesting that some of those big companies are getting involved in trying to make that happen.
That's really interesting, and it's something I experienced as well, was exactly the allocation of impact. Who gets it? Like, does Ed get it, or does Kelly get it? But you're both procured from your same field, Alan. I assume you're a farmer, and obviously I know you're not a farmer, but Kelly, can you just get into that? Like, is this, I think we talked about it, like, you're now looking at maybe like some farms that are not selling, let's just say, selling carbon credits. You're looking for those kind of growers because the allocation process is quite difficult. So is that true? Is that something that happening, or?
So we're looking for farms that are decarbonized. In other words, we understand the emission factors from those farms. If those farms are selling carbon credits in the offset voluntary carbon market, we actually can't use those farmers to make claims against our SBTI target.
Right.
That's double counting. So,
and SBTI encourages farm and forest companies to use carbon as a way to hit their SBTI target, right?
they encourage using these as these project level accounting as contracts to be able to make sure the finance is available in the supply chain to make sure those activities are happening. That's what they encourage.
So food and beverage companies basically have access to the world's stock of carbon credits, potentially. Alan?
Potentially. I mean,
Yeah.
we see, if we look at our customers, the majority of them are somehow connected with food and beverage and looking at scope 3 emissions and the decarbonisation of the supply chain, but not all of them. There are some doing it from the perspective of offsets, but that is, again, becomes one of the challenges. As you say, you cannot double count this, otherwise we're doing an enormous disservice and things will fall apart like a house of cards. So when farmers and landowners are getting into this, they need to understand the role they're playing, because potentially they exclude themselves from purchasers if they've already sold carbon credits in an offset market. I think both models will persist, but I think the pressure on the major food groups and their net zero commitments means that is probably going to be the larger share of the overall market.
Yeah, this is why I'm so personally very bullish about food and beverage companies. I think they have the answer and they have the levers to basically make this change and put carbon back in the ground. Let's go beyond carbon. Mark, what is the other, let's talk about the co-benefits to, let's just say, this kind of traceable supply chain. I'm pushing words into your mouth like biodiversity. What are the other co-benefits to this type of supply chain on climate?
Yeah, so the life cycle assessment that Foundation Earth and many others have looked at takes into account a multitude of different attributes, carbon being one, but fresh water, ecotoxicity, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. And there are a variety of methodologies that have been developed over the last 10 to 15 years. You've got Paula Nemedz's, so academic background methodologies. You've got methodologies like PEF. You've got nation-based ones as well. I mean, the problem is that everyone is trying to solve the situation, but unless we come at it from a system perspective and get a standardization, of those methods, or at least just standardize the facts that we are trying to glean from the data, and we can verify the process from the moment we take a soil core right through the logistics process, transportation, distribution, storage, right through to the packaging, and all the elements that are associated with all those attributes. It's really difficult to come up with an accurate estimate. Ground truth data, I don't want to talk about methods for a minute, but I do know one real thing. Ground truth data is absolutely critical to understanding and measuring a product's provenance across the supply chain. And I think that part of the issue to blame is that technology companies, the technology background, and their investors, are trying to look at ways in which we can create inference models that are within a margin of error and estimations of those. The problem is that as we take carbon into the financial realm, that's got to be absolutely 100% auditable. Estimates don't really matter. So again, back down to what do you want to know and how do you measure it in a physical ground truth manner? That verification process that then exists as it goes up and up the data stack and across the supply chain has itself got to be verified. It's no use Germany or the UK or another sovereign state or even a multilateral entity saying, let's bring a bunch of specialists together and they can work out what the standard is. I think we've actually got to use data and inject it into the system and see what happens. That will determine the standard that we ultimately get, because humans cannot augment this. And no amount of 10, 50, 100 specialists in a room will come up with the standard needed for a global supply chain of the complexity that we are articulating here. And I think that again, I'm not the right person to be going into the weeds here as to that ground truth data element, but I think that is a core constituent that then will determine everything else. And then we can talk about verification and all that other stuff.
So well, you mentioned there water. We don't talk about it. We talked about carbon and everything else. There are these other benefits. So like, Alan, remind us all the other co-benefits to, let's say, healthy soil.
So the carbon gets stored in the soil in the form of organic matter of one kind or another, whether that's microbial mass or fungal hyphae or whether it's humus or whatever. What that is doing, it's improving the soil structure and the soil health, so it's better for plant growth. It's improving the soil biodiversity as well, both at the microbial level but also at a higher level. From a water perspective, the carrying capacity of matter, of soil, once it has the organic matter in it, is much, much higher. So from both a drought prevention but also a flood mitigation perspective, it has huge benefits, as well as preventing some of the runoff issues that we know affect rivers, certainly here in the UK, and I'm sure much more widely as well. So the co-benefits that come along with building that organic matter in the soil are huge. They are harder to measure in many ways. There's a lot of effort going into that, and I'm sure the technology is going to improve. But just trying to measure biodiversity, whether it's within the soil or other soil, is a real challenge. We know a lot of our customers are looking at how they're going to do that next, but trying to put numbers on it, and also the fungibility of that, an improvement in biodiversity here versus an improvement in biodiversity in another country manifesting itself in a different way is much harder to compare. But the co-benefits are definitely there. And it's one of the things which drives the real sustainability of agricultural practice. And it's one of the reasons that many of the food companies have been pushing this for a period of time, is that they know that they've got to be producing food in 20, 30, 40 years' time. They're looking at it from a long-term perspective. And without this change in agricultural practices, they're going to find it very difficult to do that.
So we've got your carbon, we've got your improving flood defense, so it's good mitigation. So it basically makes Kelly, you were saying, makes your supply chain more secure. You said there's not many of these type of, do you see a more consistent yield from those type of growers? Do you less volatility? That's why you need that in your supply chain as well?
Yes, over the long term. I mean, I can't say that that's been approved in our supply chain yet because there's just not enough suppliers supplying these low carbon products. But from my understanding of the science, of course, and just capturing that data, having that leverage over your supply chain, you'll be able to understand, the long-term impact of those farmers, their climate resiliency, based on the practices that they're adopting. So you have that leverage over the supply chain from just having that visibility and data coming from those farms.
Nutrients, Ed. Talk about the health aspect. Did your food taste better?
I'm so glad you mentioned that. And I think it was actually you who gave me a heads up on something really exciting a few weeks ago. And we're talking about what you can optimize to select for regenerative farming, and nutrient density is it. There is a clear link between the soil microbiome and its diversity, and the compounds that are then given up to the plants. Plants photosynthesize, and they give up 40% of those sugars and those products to the microbial communities around their roots. Why do they do that? Well, it's because in harder times, they can then rely on those communities for these phytochemicals that we call vitamins. So it suits that the healthier the soil, the greater the nutrient density of the food we get from it. So optimizing for nutrient density, I thought was when that capability gets into the hands of consumers, or at the very least retailers, that's going to be enormously powerful. And that it's good to optimize for things like carbon, but again, beware the carbon tunnel vision. So I was going to talk about so nutrient density. There's something else. Oh yes, that was it. We were going to talk about the other kind of things that are good to capture along the supply chain.
Yeah.
So the reason that I gave you a heads up on wanting to speak about that was because quite unusual for a sustainability manager at Innovation Zero to admit this, but the word data turns me off. When I hear the D word, I struggle to maintain concentration on anything else that comes next. But we've recently gone through an exercise that's made me think about what data is to our business and what we would like to capture, the information that we would like to capture in our supply chains. And we've had the luxury of organic supply chains for the last 35 years. They are intensely segregated, tested for compliance. That all adds significant cost. We are a premium brand in a cost of living crisis, so we're looking to diversify the range. There's the D word again. So if we've spent the last 35 years maintaining customer expectations on GM policies and no air freight and deforestation-free promises, etc., we've had the relative luxury of organic to provide that assurance. Hey, it's organic, it's fine. Now that we're looking outside of that, it has been a wild roller coaster. How do we get this information? No one knows beyond a certain level of supplier what the GM status of the animal feed is, for example. Deforestation-free pledges are not worth diddly without a cut-off date. Well, if you don't know the date that the land use change happened, what's your cut-off date? So this is all very useful information that when I hear the word data now, I think, I know what you're talking about. Let's talk. Yeah.
I mean, to be honest with you, we try to keep this there's so much to cover on this whole topic, and I just really would encourage you, if you're really interested in this, please come and talk to everyone on the panel. I've worked with all these people before, and they are innovators in this area, and they're pushing the envelope. They really are. And there's obviously so much more that can be done. I do want to throw it out to maybe one or two questions. I think we've got 5 minutes left. Has anyone got any burning questions? Is it Addy?
Firstly, thank you so much. And also, I think without that kind of leadership that all of you present, this is starting to happen now, and it's happening because all of you are taking it really seriously. Can I make one comment and then ask a couple of questions? Cool, thanks. So my comment was, I'm not so sure I feel like the driving force is the advertising side. For me, the really obvious driving force is Scope 3 commitments, which have to be made and have been made, and now you've got to do them. And secondly, I do think it really is the sustainability of the food supply chain. It's that kind of, we only have 50 harvests left. And all of those two things, they're two massive drivers, and they come together to create real genesis for all these things you're talking about. So that was my comment. My question, so I'll cut to the top two. I think this sector's changed a lot in the last 2 years from I'm trying to work this out. How do I do this? Don't know how to do it. Think this is coming. To this is happening now. And I think the two biggest things that have changed the most in the last 2 years is, although it's complex, as you spoke to well, I do think the infrastructure is kind of there now that people can do it. And the second thing, which I think's maybe been missed a bit here, but I wanted your opinion on, is food supply chain is a Scope 3 requirement for almost every sector. And so this is a real food and bev lens on food supply chain as Scope 3. But in my head, you've also got all the chemicals companies, you've also got all the banks. Like, the joy here for the extra impact and catalyst is how many different industries financially need to invest in getting this done. So to bring those round into questions, is the infrastructure been improving, or is that my imagination? Is it kind of there now, or is it not? And secondly, are you collaborating with other corporates in other industries to do this together or not? Sorry, so long.
Kelly?
Yeah, sure, I can answer to some extent. So yes, collaborating with other industries, absolutely. There's so much to do pre-competitive in this space. The infrastructure is there. I completely agree with that. It needs to be tested. Imagine a shipment of cocoa beans coming into the port in London. With that shipment might have 10,000 smallholder farmers or contributing to that supply of that lot. And so we need to really, test. Can we capture that information? Can we make sure that is no deforestation? Can we have the chain of custody in the supply chain to make sure that that no deforestation product ends up in our procurement? And that infrastructure, it really needs to be implemented at this point, tested, and that's where we're at.
I think your point about the Scope 3 commitments coming up is absolutely bang on. And I was always going to invite cynicism leading with the threat to the marketing claim. That, for me, is the biggest pain in the arse today. But you're absolutely right. We've got the SBTI commitments coming up fast, and things are not decarbonising as quickly as we need them to. So we absolutely, I do believe the infrastructure is there. But again, until we can standardise, how does anything get critical mass?
Alan, do you want to add?
So I think we see a huge change now from where we were 2.5 years ago. At that point, we had a lot of problems trying to get traction with project developers. There just weren't mature project developers out there who knew how to deal with soil carbon. And a lot of that was down to the fact that until we came along and took these things out of the ground and started measuring them, they didn't have that access to high quality, high volume ground truth data. And so it made no sense for project developers to try and understand the rather complex soil carbon accounting protocols. Those protocols have really developed in those last 2.5 years, but I think probably the biggest change is from an education perspective. So we spent a lot of time in the early stages talking to the more pioneering food and beverage companies about about the protocols, how they worked, how measurement, reporting, and verification worked, and so on. We're finding those conversations much, much easier now. We're finding that a lot of people are already over that hump of needing to understand all of the basics. So we're seeing a very different landscape now compared to where we were 2.5 years ago.
Question? Yeah?
So working. Yeah, hi. Thanks, everyone. I just had a quick question about some of the LCAs and kind of carbon auditing. We've kind of all agreed as a panel that we need more data. We need kind of an LCA for each product, so we know the footprint of what we're eating, what it might be. Obviously, that's a massive task. We're not just talking about kind of one per product, we're talking about one per product per production system. How are we going to do that? How is that, how would you like to see that funded? What kind of policy, government support, supply chain support do we need for that to happen? Because, leaving it just up to the farmers to do it themselves, no, I don't think that's necessarily reasonable or will get the progress that we need.
I'm going to plug Wiliot now. Wiliot. No, but in theory, yes, it is. It has been an infrastructure issue. The tech probably hasn't. People haven't realised the tech is there, but the cost of data acquisition has always been so high. It's now low. We've had this journey of going from atoms to bits. Using it. It's now got AI and it's there. It's pervasive and it's everywhere now. We've got ChatGPT, but we need to connect it back to the physical world. Go back to connecting it to atoms, and now you can with ambient IoT, which is literally going to be the next big wave for business, B2B. That's where machine to machine will solve this problem. I mean, Walmart is doing this. They are like, there's AI, it was announced last week, I think it was, they're now using AI procurement, asking to procure the most efficient supply chain in theory, and do price negotiation. So that's my kind of answer to that kind of question. Did anyone have an answer? One more question. I think last question.
Thank you very much. I believe you're all in the business of nourishing people. So my question is, should we be trying to apply artificial intelligence to a system that's broken when we should be just applying the other AI, which is actual intelligence, to coming up with something really, really different?
I just want to add, I will...
And by the way, you're all invited to the London Community Kitchen in Harrow, where we have a regenerative farm, a smart farm.
Brilliant.
And actually feed 20,000 people every week. So that's about the other issue.
Wow.
Wow.
I mean, yeah, I totally agree with you. I think what I've seen is like, we've just talked about complexity. Like we've gone from I don't think the food system's broken. It's just optimized for the wrong thing. It was feed the world, availability of food, get it there. But sadly, that quality is poor. So we've got unhealthy people, we've got too many calories. So we now need to add on a health lens, a climate lens. And sadly, as humans, we don't have the time and the ability to handle that complexity. So we should leverage the thing that we're supposedly built now to like answer that question and optimize it. So I think we should. But anything else?
So I think the data has an opportunity to provide real insights into how we can do things better. I think it allows us, for example, through measurement, to understand this practice has been more effective in this particular combination of soil type, climate, geography, and so on. So I think it has the opportunity to drive that forward, but we mustn't sort of take our eyes off the fact of what we're trying to achieve: overall sustainability, tasty food, and a system that works and is fair to the farmers who have to adopt these new practices.
I think we've got to wrap up there, unfortunately. So
Yeah.
if any more kind of questions, please come and see the panel, and myself will be on the stand, F26 Wiliot. But thanks very much.
Let's thank our panel and our moderator for the very, very interesting discussion. And the next session would be focusing on scaling carbon removal, and it starts in 2 minutes.